When buying a home in Florida, you're going to hear all kinds of real estate terms thrown around, like CDD, Homestead Exemption, as-is contract. But what do those really mean? So today I'm going to go through the 10 most misunderstood Florida real estate concepts so that every buyer is aware of what they really mean before they sign the contract. The first term is CDD. What does CDD stand for? CDD stands for Community Development District. So at first, it might sound like just another HOA, but it's actually not that. It's actually a governmental entity that is set up for the infrastructure for the roads, waterways, and community development in certain communities. And it's actually added to your property tax bill as a non-ad valorem tax. So these can cost thousands of dollars, $1,000 to $3,000 plus per annum. There are bonds that last 20 to 30 years. There's also a maintenance component of it. So you really want to understand if your community has a CDD, and always, always, always look up the property tax bill prior to placing an offer to see exactly how much the CDD is if there's a CDD in your community. You also want to be aware for new construction properties to inquire if there's a CDD, and also how long the CDD is for and what is the amount that your particular parcel will be responsible to pay. The second thing I want to cover is the Homestead Exemption. Many buyers who purchase properties in Florida assume that this is automatic. It's actually not automatic. You must apply for a Homestead Exemption by March 1st of the year after you purchase the property. You only have to apply once, but you do have to do that application. The Homestead Exemption can get you up to $50,000 reduction towards your taxable value on your property tax bill. So it's really important to file for it. And a pro tip also is Homestead Exemptions also protect you from some creditors' liability in Florida. So it's definitely very important that you apply for it and you get it on your tax bill. The third thing I want to cover is HOAs. Not all HOAs are considered equal in Florida. Some HOAs have very strict guidelines, and they can even fine you for things like your mailbox color or your grass height. You want to make sure that you understand and read the covenants, the CC&Rs of the community, so you understand what rules you're going to have to follow in that particular community. Now, a lot of people have bad impressions of HOAs. From my experience, there are some HOAs that can actually be good. So you want to see what it covers for you, what it includes, what fees you're paying for. So HOAs, just understand they're not all created equal. Some are better than others, some are more strict than others, and you want to understand what the rules are before you sign and buy a property. The fourth thing I want to cover is the as-is contract. So the as-is contract I find very confusing to buyers and sellers who don't do a lot of real estate transactions in Florida. Buyers assume that they can't request any repairs. That's absolutely not true. Typically, inspection periods can be 7 to 14 days, and during that period, you can back out of the contract as a buyer for any reason. It doesn't even have to be a repair reason. So you can definitely perform an inspection, come back, get the report. If there's any repairs that need to be made, you can request them from the seller, or you can request a credit at closing. Just because it's an as-is contract does not mean that you cannot request repairs. Another thing I want to mention is the as-is contract is the most common contract used in Florida real estate transactions. So most of the contracts I've seen, I'd say 99.9% of the contracts are written using this form. So it's not an unusual form to use, and you shouldn't be scared of it. You just need to understand what the parameters are, but don't be thrown off by the fact that it's called an as-is contract. The fifth most misunderstood term that I want to cover is FIRPTA, the Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act. Yes, it's a tongue twister, and everybody refers to it as FIRPTA. Why is this important? If the seller is a non-resident of the United States, then you need to withhold 15% of the sales price, and that needs to be remitted to the IRS. This is generally done by the title company. There is some compliance and reporting involved. And also, if this isn't caught early, it could potentially hold up the transaction. So you want to make sure you determine the seller's residency status early in the transaction. Also, it's very important to note that if this money is not withheld and the seller does not file their taxes, it is potentially the responsibility of the buyer to remit this money, which I know can be very confusing, but it does fall on the buyer if this money is not remitted by the seller. And the title companies generally handle this at closing, but make sure to get the seller's residency status up front so you don't have any last minute fire drills or hiccups. The sixth thing that I want to go over is the Estoppel certificate. This is a document that's provided by the HOA, which shows exactly what the seller owes, if there's any open violations or any special assessments. So a buyer is going to want this document so you don't inherit any dues that are owed by the seller or any unforeseen unresolved issues that the HOA may have. Typically, the Estoppel costs about $200 to $500. Every HOA is different, so they charge a different amount. It's typically paid for by the seller. It's also going to show if there's any capital contributions or any prepaid HOA dues that should be paid at closing. So it's a very important document, the Estoppel certificate. The seventh item I want to go over is flood zones versus evacuation zones. So flood zones are determined by FEMA, and that actually determines if your lender is going to require flood insurance. Now, evacuation zones, on the other hand, are determined by the county, and they are based on the risk of storm surge and evacuation planning for emergencies. So they serve very different purposes. You can be either in a flood zone or an evacuation zone or both or neither, but they are very different and they get confused all the time. The eighth thing I want to discuss is a binding contract. It's very important to understand that a contract is not binding unless it has been signed and delivered by all parties, seller and buyer. So in Florida, a verbal acceptance does not constitute a legally binding contract. It has to be signed and initialed in all appropriate places across the contract and the addendums for it to be legally binding. So time is of the essence in any contract, but especially in competitive markets. So if you want to have a legally binding contract, make sure you get that signed, make sure you get it initialed, signed, sealed, and delivered so you know you have a legally binding contract. The next thing that I want to discuss is the status of a listing active under contract. This has been really confusing to a lot of buyers. Not all MLSs have that status, but the ones that do, a lot of buyers think because they see active that it's still for sale. That's actually not true. It just means that the seller is accepting backup offers for that property, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's active for sale, that you can actually buy that particular property. So it's a very big distinction between active and active under contract. Pending typically means that you're going towards the closing and you're not really accepting backup offers, but in some MLSs, pending can also be accepting backup offers. So you just want to talk to your agent about what terms and what statuses are available in your particular area. The 10th thing I want to talk about is appraisal versus inspection. Many buyers confuse what these two items are. The appraisal is required by a lender to get an opinion of value by a third-party professional for the property, so they know how much they can lend on. That actually protects the lender. The inspection is optional. Obviously, it's something that we highly recommend to most of our buyers so that you can uncover unforeseen issues with the home or maybe repairs that need to be made and make sure you're comfortable that you're buying a good asset. So you need an appraisal, you need an inspection. The buyers pay for both, but one protects the lender and one protects the buyer. I would also argue that appraisals can also protect you so you know that you're not overpaying for a property. But it's very important that these two things are distinctly different, so understand what both of them mean. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that I have cleared up a few misconceptions about different real estate terminology. If you have any questions, please give us a call. We'd love to help you on your next real estate transaction. Make it a great day.